Okay, all set.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Let me convene our meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, September 14th, 2021. It's been a little while since we've had our last one, so glad to see everybody here again. First item on the agenda is the agenda, and we are going to add a new item 7, which is a census report from Megan. She gave one to the City Council last night, and it sounded like it was going to be pretty interesting, so we thought it might be nice for all of us to hear as well. Any other changes to the agenda? Emily, was that fixing your computer or raising your hand?
It was turning up the volume because I'm so interested in the census data. I'm so sure.
All right, then we have our agenda with that one amendment. Next item is the chair's report. I don't have anything to report, so we'll go right to the director's report. David.
Thank you, Andy. Just a handful of things. The City Council Ordinance Committee met, I think it was last week now, considered 3 amendments that the commission sent up last month. This are the Act 179 changes, the building height measurement, and the Article 14 changes. They were all approved by the ordinance committee with some minor tweaks, and I believe going to the council for a second reading and final public hearing on October 18th. We have an awful lot of stuff on our plate right now. We kind of went into this year with a whole bunch of priority kind of projects and initiatives, from restarting BTV Stat, reorganizing our office, to helping to organize a second housing summit with the mayor's office, an impact fee study, economic development strategy, redistricting, the STR amendment, which hopefully the council's ordinance committee will meet and discuss in another week or two. And we probably ought to consider rezoning the school property if BHS is going to stay at its current site, which are the 2 top preferred sites. The zoning really ought to be able to facilitate that and support that. So that's something that's on our list. So I'll have this really long list. We had a whole bunch of other things that have gotten thrown on top of it. And I mention all this because I think some of you are aware that last night, the council had on their agenda a zoning amendment to eliminate the minimum on-site parking requirements citywide, expand the related TDM requirements citywide, and the matter was to be referred to the council's ordinance committee. The long and short of that was that item got postponed because the meeting was getting really late. So it'll come up at a subsequent meeting. But I thought it worth just kind of offering what staff's perspective is on that initiative. We've been in conversations with Councilor Hanson and his staff person, Gene Bergman, for months over this idea, and have pretty consistently recommended, this is a good topic to be included in a broader housing discussion because it's about how we affect the affordability of housing. We're very supportive of getting rid of the minimum requirements, on-site requirements, but are a little leery about expanding the TDM requirements when we don't know what kind of an impact ultimately that's going to have on the ability to produce housing. And we don't have a bigger picture understanding of what kind of a citywide TDM program should look like and best serve the community. That's another project that was added to our work list in the final throes of the budget. And we really think that work ought to happen first. Then with that providing some direction, we can change the zoning accordingly to help facilitate that. But Councilor Hanson was fairly insistent on getting this ball moving, so he introduced his amendment anyway. Ultimately, it's a matter that does have to come back to the Planning Commission for you to at least make any technical corrections, warn a public hearing, and send it back to them. So don't be worried that you won't see this and have a bite at the apple. You will. I suspect it'll take a matter of a couple of months or so before that even shows up on your plate, because it's still got, if it goes to the ordinance committee first, it's got to get through their list of to-dos. So that's kind of my update on what's going on with that that particular item.
Good. Anything else, David?
Not for tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then we'll move to item 4, which is the public forum. And Megan, do we have anyone here for our public forum?
I am assuming yes. We have Sharon Busher on the line here, and I'm going to, Sharon, can you hear us and talk?
Hi, I'm Megan. Did you ask if I wanted to speak?
Yes, would you like to speak?
Yes, I would. Thank you. Hi, this is Sharon Busher, and I'm interested in the topics tonight. I thank you so much for the draft that has the changes in it for. I really couldn't follow it, and I'd called Megan earlier because I was having difficulty understanding that. So that really helped me. When you get to the adaptive reuse bonuses, I guess it's really hard to, the table's clear, but I guess I was having a hard time figuring out if there was a maximum lot coverage that would result from this, because it allows up to 125% of the current footprint of the building. And I just couldn't figure it out. And I know that the other table that doesn't apply allows, with bonuses, allows 62%, I think it is, something like that. And so I just wanted to know how much beyond that it would be potentially. And so if when you have that discussion, somebody can answer that question or ask the question on my behalf, I'd very much appreciate that. Other than that, I just found it interesting, and it made sense to me. The other points, the other issues that you've got on your table are that hodgepodge of different amendments. And I understand the desire to streamline, but I did want to once again weigh in on the first one that talks about changing one non-residential use to another. And I understand most of the time it's really a no-brainer, but sometimes it does change the impact. It could be a lot more truck or delivery traffic. It could be more noise associated. So it would have an impact on the neighborhood and especially the abutters. And when it's administrative review or basic review like that, it really precludes that. And I'm a little concerned about that. Also, in your definition of what would be allowed, it talks about small lots under the basic permit, and that seemed okay, but it doesn't, in the final statement, it doesn't seem to address if the lot has less than 60 feet street frontage. I think it's fine. It just doesn't say that would still be okay and wouldn't require review, but it's silent on that. It mentions it above, but then in the final, it doesn't address whether or not that would qualify for a basic permit. I like that component of your proposed amendments. I think the basic permit's a good one. The last one is the flood hazard permits, and I'm not well enough versed to know what evaluation the Department of Environmental Conservation does. And that's key in this because you say you administratively you would look to that evaluation. So I don't know. Does it look at the stability of soil? Does it look at? I just don't know what it looks at, and so it would be really nice to understand what that evaluation includes, so that I feel like I wouldn't voice any concerns when this makes it through the process. But those are my total comments for tonight. I thought I'd give them up front, so when you discuss, you might have them, and I hope that if they don't get addressed, the chair would allow me to bring them up to make sure that I understand the answer to those questions or comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Megan, is there anybody else?
That's all I see, Andy.
Okay, then we'll close the public forum and move on to item 5, which is a proposed CDO amendment, ZA-22-01 Historic Preservation Bonus. And just as we kick this off, David, you said, I think that you circulated a different draft. Was it of this?
So I posted online and emailed to all the commissioners a red line version of the draft. The version that originally got posted in your packet, when it was converted from a Word file to a PDF, all of the track changes got lost. So I posted and sent you all one that has red line.
Got it. Great. Thank you.
So this amendment is really a companion to an amendment which currently sits before the Council Ordinance Committee, dealing with the definition of an adaptive reuse, where you may recall staff was recommending that the definition be changed to be consistent with what is common historic preservation practice of what an adaptive reuse really means. In doing so, staff gave further thought to then we have this adaptive reuse bonus. It no longer fits with the definition that we were proposing. So we at least need to change the name of it. And in part of that conversation resulted in an amendment that kind of does that. It changes the name of this bonus intended to support the rehabilitation of historic buildings in residential areas. We moved it to the section of the ordinance that deals with historic buildings, section 5.4.8, and we included it. We made it also applicable in the institutional zone, where most of the properties that are not institutionally owned are residential in character and nature. So there are historic residential properties that could benefit from this bonus that is really intended to help facilitate their historically sensitive rehabilitation. You can see I'm hesitating in using the words adaptive reuse because that's how I think of it, but I also appreciate that that's a term of art that we need to be careful about how we use it. So this amendment does those three things. And specific to the question that Sharon asked about maximum height, lot coverage, density, for any bonuses that may be applicable, Megan actually just scrolled past it in what's on the screen. It's table 4.4.5-8, which, regardless of which bonus or combination of bonuses that you use in a residential zone, the maximum lot coverages and densities and building heights are all shown here. So that's the gist of the amendment as proposed.
Before I open it up for just a clarification, David, when you took out the section on the adaptive reuse section and created the new section on historic building sites, and you have the table 4.4.5.6. Are the coverage that are allowed under your new way of presenting it different than what was allowed under the old way of presenting it?
It was simply a copy and paste of the two things. So if they're inconsistent, they have always been inconsistent. And I think,
I'm not necessarily asking if it's, I mean, it might be, I was just checking to see what the differences are. This, you know, I know the name changed and the way it's presented has changed, but just substantively, whether it's different than what it was before.
Yep. So if I compare the section, the 4.4.5-8 maximum lot coverage in an RL says 50%. And as you're asking that question, I see that the table in the new section needs to be renamed and renumbered, but that RL maximum lot coverage goes up to 62% with an inclusionary allowance. So we will want to double check that we have the inclusionary, that all of the maximums are equivalent to what that inclusionary allows for.
Okay.
I think that ultimately getting to Sharon's question.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, Alex.
Just a quick question. I feel like I should know this, but I don't. What is the abbreviation DU/AC in that table?
Dwelling units per acre.
Yeah,
I'll keep that under my hat.
yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Anyone? Okay. So the recommended action here by staff is to approve the report and warn for public hearing. We could do that. We could send it to committee. We could do whatever we want. Anyone want to move this forward? Emily?
I'll move it forward. I motion to warn this for public hearing with
And
the
approve the
report.
bylaw amendment report.
And we'll approve the bylaw amendment report. I think anything that gives any sort of incentives to adaptive reuse is positive. I know there's a lot of funky old buildings that don't fit into the existing zoning, and I think can't be rehabilitated and reused and are falling into disrepair because of that. So my hope would be that some more flexibility will allow some of those to be, have some money put into them and go back into service of our community.
Thank you. So there was a motion by Emily. Is there a second? Seconded by Alex. Any more discussion?
The general mantra in construction, irrespective of where we are in the country, is that it's cheaper to tear things down and build a new structure than adapt an old one. So to the extent that this helps, I'm all for it.
Thanks. Anyone else? Seeing none, I think we're ready to vote. All in favor of the motion as presented by Emily, please say aye, raise your hand. Right. And Eves is doing neither. Eves, are you there?
Are you sure he said play dog play or is it oh my dog?
Well,
Or he's watching Go Dog Go.
any opposed? So I'd say it's semi-unanimous. We don't quite know where Eves is, but
I'll just
So-
mark him as an abstention.
okay, good. We do have our quorum nonetheless. All right, well, thank you. Then we're on to item 6, which is proposed CDO amendment ZA-22-02 permitting simplifications. This must be Scott, which is why you're here.
So yeah, this is my
All right.
favorite kind of zoning amendment, it actually reduces some of the text in our CDO and makes things a little bit easier. There's 3 pieces here. They're all pretty straightforward, but I do think that they'll have noticeable, perceptible impact in making things a little bit easier, eliminating some requirements that don't do much presently. And the first one pertains to changing one permitted non-residential use to another permitted non-residential use. Up until the parking standards were changed recently, the only thing we were looking at in those cases really was the parking requirement. And with that having been eliminated, we're looking at nothing. So it seems that we're not accomplishing much by requiring folks to apply for a zoning permit that says that they can change from a retail shop to a tattoo parlor downtown with no standards at all. So this is a pretty tightly construed exemption. It doesn't pertain to special uses under Article 5, and it doesn't pertain to major impacts, and it doesn't pertain to conditional uses. Just one permitted non-residential to another one. So do we want to take questions?
Yeah, let's do them one at a time. Any questions for Scott on that one? Okay, you look good to go.
Okay, great. The second one pertains to basic zoning permits, and much of the city is in design review, but a fair portion of the city is not in design review. It's basically the residential low density district that's not design review. And within that district, you get what's called a basic zoning permit. And what we look at is site plan. So we look at lot coverage and setbacks, some dimensional things like driveway width applies. Eves, are you looking to speak to us?
I think Eves is back.
Basically, it's site plan review. Okay, so the intent is to be quick and easy for the homeowner in this low density zone, except that we have a whole bunch of exemptions. Anything that's not a single family home needs design review, even if it's in that district. So duplexes, condos, the rare commercial use. But the kicker is, if you have a substandard lot, that also throws you into design review. So we had a recent example of some guy looking to do an addition. I think it was on Stanford. And the minimum lot size requirement or lot frontage requirement is 60 feet. So he had a detached single family home, residential low density zone. He had a conforming lot size, but he was 2 feet shy on frontage. So instead of a basic zoning permit, he had to get himself a certificate of appropriateness design review permit, which entailed elevation drawings, more complicated review. So the whole point here is to simply remove the trigger as to lot size and frontage. So if you're in the RL zone, have a detached single family home, it's not historic, we can do a basic zoning permit. That's the punchline.
Any questions for Scott on this one? Or comments? All
On
right.
the, can you give me the cliff notes on the, say if it's multiple units, what the process would look like?
If it's anything other than a detached single family, so duplex, triplex, condos, it's subject to design review. So in addition to the site plan, we'd look at elevation drawings, materials, lighting levels, basically everything in Article 6.
Anything else, Michael? Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right, Scott. Back to
Okay,
you.
last one.
Sorry, Andy, if you are okay with taking a question from Sharon Busher, she's raising her hand.
Sure.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. I was listening, but I still wasn't clear. The 60-foot street frontage will not trigger will not trigger a more extensive review. It will still allow people to get a basic permit. Is that what I understood? You used an example, and then I wasn't sure of what the answer was. So I just want to understand that. Thank you.
The frontage trigger will go away because of a tweak to section 3.1.2 that removes reference to conforming lot. So that
Thank
pertains
you.
to lot frontage as well as lot size.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, I think we're all set, Andy.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And last but not least, city has a flood zone. It's on Lake Champlain and the Winooski River. And the ferry company is pretty used to, at this point, going to DRB for ticket booth and patios. We just had the Intervale Center along the river come to DRB to do, I think it was an 8 or 6 feet wide by maybe 20-foot long boardwalk over a spillway. So these things would otherwise be handled administratively, but the current wording of the flood standards send everything, so like everything, the ticket booth to a new hotel, to DRB. So the CDO has a number of triggers that sends things to DRB, like being big enough, right? Like the new hotel. But there's a whole bunch of small things that can occur administratively. So this amendment simply looks to eliminate the all-inclusive DRB review for anything in the flood zone. And as Sharon mentioned earlier, the statutory review by A&R is still required. So with this amendment adopted, the Intervale Center wanting to do their little boardwalk could be done administratively, but before I press the buttons to review it, I'd have to send it to A&R and they have 30 days to comment on it. So same process as with DRB. And what they do is they review the proposal under our standards. And sometimes they provide comment. Most of the time they do, sometimes they decline to.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments on this one? Any questions, comments in general on this? It all seem pretty straightforward.
I'm just glad that it meets Scott's criterion for his favorite kind of zoning amendment.
I know, simplifying something, Alex, my God.
Well, I mean, like, how often does the ticket booth need a permit? You know, like once every 3 years or something? It's like, it
Something
seems
like
kind of
that.
silly.
All right. So staff's recommendation on this one, again, was to approve the municipal bylaw amendment report and warn for public hearing. Does anybody want to move for that or take any other action?
I move that
Alex?
we warn this for a public hearing with its associated report.
All right. And is there a second? Seconded by Michael. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? That appears to be unanimous from the people who are here. Thank you. Now we're on to the new item 7, which is the census data report. Again, this is one I understand, Megan, you gave to the council yesterday. And when she described it to me the other day, I thought it might be of interest to the commission.
Yes, so I am just sharing my screen here so I can share the presentation that I gave last night to the council with all of you. So one of the things that I noted in sharing this with the council last night is that the reason we're calling this an initial data release, a summary of an initial data release, is because this data from the 2020 census is a very simple version of the data that's collected as part of the census, specifically for use in redistricting. So this is a technical data file that was delivered to the folks that handle congressional and state legislative redistricting, and will also be a data set that we will use here in Burlington when evaluating the necessity and options for redistricting in Burlington. So what this data release included was information about the total population of Burlington and the population that is 18 and older. It includes information about the race and ethnicity of our population, and it includes information about the total number of housing units and whether they're occupied or vacant. We, even in, just the recent few months, the work that we've been doing on short-term rentals and other projects, we frequently reference census data to help us understand additional dynamics about our population, about households, about housing units, and other social and economic characteristics about our community. That data is not available at this time. We expect that a lot of those other data points, as well as the cross tabulations that help us compare different data points, will be released on a rolling basis into 2022. So when more data becomes available, we'll anxiously be downloading it and using it for the work that we're doing on a regular basis. But there are some insights that we can gain from this initial redistricting data set that was released. This is a very simple chart that just shows how the city's total population has been changing from 2000 to 2020 in the decennial census. So in the last 10 years, we saw a population increase of a little over 5% to a total population of 44,743. And I'll post these slides on the website where you get your agendas. There's a link here at the bottom if you're interested. The Vermont Center for Geographic Information prepared a really interesting interactive website that allows you to look at the population change from 2010 to 2020 for every town in Vermont. The population change in Burlington was not the greatest population change of Chittenden County municipalities. We saw big increases in population in Williston, in South Burlington, and in Essex in particular. But this is what the city's population looks like according to the 2020 census. When we look at race and ethnicity of the city's population, we see that just over 82% identifies as white, and the remainder, 17.8%, identifies as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as people of 2 or more races. We also learned from this census that 3.7% of the city's population identifies as Hispanic or Latino. This is a change from a pretty big change from the 2010 census, where almost 89% of the city's population identified as white alone. And you can see in the graph on the right that it shows some information just about how the distribution between races in the city changed between 2010 and 2020. One thing that I'll note here is that in the 2020 census, the Census Bureau changed, and I think in a lot of ways improved, the process for how they collect information about race from respondents. So in the past, the questions were not as flexible and didn't give people as many opportunities to answer a question about their race and their ethnicity. So the 2-question format that was used in this census gave a lot more opportunity for people to self-identify, particularly as multiracial. So the changes that we see here in the population for Burlington, especially in the white alone population and the population of 2 or more races, those are the biggest groups where we saw increases and decreases in our population, are pretty consistent with the trends in the United States overall. And the census talks about this change reflecting 2 things. One is that there have been different demographic shifts in the last 10 years that have resulted in a much more diverse population, both here in Burlington as well as in the United States. And the opportunity for people to answer this question in a more flexible way to represent their identity reflects the real multiracial nature of the population as a whole. So it's both about demographic changes and about better reflecting the population as a whole. In this data set, we can also see how the city's population changed ward by ward. So this graph just compares the population of each of the city's wards from 2010 to 2020. And on the right, you see a map of those wards. So most of the city's wards did see some population increase in the last 10 years, with wards 3 and ward 7 being pretty level in that time. So one of the things that David and I and others on our data team, our new data analysts that we've inherited this fiscal year, have been looking at this data and trying to ground truth it, just based on what we understand about where development has occurred in the city and other changes that we're aware of in the last 10 years. And we think that this seems pretty reasonable. You'll see that there is one note here about adjusting for a data error related to UVM dorm locations. So when we downloaded this data in its original format, it looked like there was a really significant growth in population in Ward 6 and a significant loss of population in Ward 8. And luckily, because Jay Appleton is still here and working with us in the city and was around for the 2015 redistricting process, he alerted us to the fact that it looks like a data misallocation has been repeated in the 2020 census that we also saw in 2010, where about 1,000 people are misidentified in Ward 6 that are actually living in Ward 8 on the UVM campus. So that's something that we're working to correct, and the data charts that you see here reflect the assumption that we will make that correction going forward. One of the reasons that we look at this data, as I mentioned, is that this is the redistricting data set. So one of the things that we have been looking at with this data is how the city's population changes relative to the rough approximation of the size that a ward should be. So when we talk about the size of legislative districts, voting districts here in the city, the standard for an ideal size of a voting district is basically the number of districts you have, the total population divided by the number of districts you have. So in Burlington, that means dividing the city's total population by 8 wards. So this chart on the right shows the same data from the last chart just for 2020. And the sort of middle dotted line shows what that ideal size might be for each of the city's wards. One of the standards that is used to determine if redistricting is necessary is the population then of each ward relative to that size. And there's a standard of kind of 10% plus or minus that ideal size as being one of the thresholds. So you can see here kind of how each of the wards' populations fall within that range. Ward 1 is just a little bit outside of that at 11.7% more than the ideal size. And Ward 7 is just on the verge of that at 9.7% smaller than the ideal size. We also look at the total difference in the most and least populated wards. So this chart organizes the wards across the horizontal axis based on greatest to least populated relative to that size. So you can see that there's actually about 21% percent points difference between the most and least populated ward in the city. So one of the questions that was asked directly of us last night at the city council meeting was, does this mean that redistricting is necessary? And both from our perspective, from looking at the data, as well as from the city attorney's perspective, I think the answer is yes, that we will expect that redistricting will be taking place here in Burlington with this data. And then the last data point that we have from this release is just about the total number of housing units in the city. Again, this compares how the reported number of units have been changing since 2000. In the 2020 census, there was a reported 18,282 housing units in Burlington. And I think the change that we've seen from 2010 to 2020 is about 1,300 housing units, and tracks pretty closely with what we have been tracking and reporting on from time to time with the Housing Summit and other housing data metrics that we've been following in terms of that housing growth that we've seen over the last 10 years. So that's that's all that I have here in terms of what was available in the data. And I can answer any questions if there are any of the commissioners.
Great. Thank you. That was really interesting. Any questions for Megan or comments?
Not a question. I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing that. That was really, really great information to have.
You're welcome. Thanks
Agreed.
to Andy for suggesting that we should bring this to you also.
Emily?
I'd be interested to know from staff what stuck out to you when you were reviewing this data as like an interest, something you didn't, that was surprising. Was there anything surprising in the data?
Well, honestly, when we first started looking at the data discrepancy that we found that was repeated was definitely surprising. It was a really interesting process for us, though, to kind of go back and say, does that make sense in terms of what we know happened in terms of development and other shifts in the community? We kept trying to think like, well, Champlain College dorms were built and, you know, all these different projects. And then we finally realized that really is just an error. So that was one thing that jumped out. I think the other thing is just seeing the diversity of the city's population. We have heard, and I think one of the things that you may remember that we talked about when we were updating the comprehensive plan was that the youth in the city's school district is much more racially diverse than our adult population. And we have long thought that the estimates were maybe underrepresenting that diversity. So it was, I appreciated seeing and understanding how the census improved the process for reporting on race and ethnicity in this data release.
As Megan noted, that this is a small sliver of the census data that we'll be getting over the course of the next several months. So, you know, the really juicy stuff will come more like in the spring and summer of next year to really understand how the population has changed in greater detail, how the housing units have changed or evolved. So stay tuned.
Yeah, especially things like the renter and owner occupied mix, things like the income of households in the city. Those are all things that we're really looking forward to seeing the data releases for.
Good. Michael?
Yeah, I just had a question on that data error. Are the, just as way of background, are the wards coterminous with tracks or block, well, tracks and blocks, I suppose, and how did that come about?
The wards are not coincidental with the tract boundaries. They do generally have blocks that fit within them, so we can disaggregate the data at that very small level and help us figure out how to allocate them. We're not entirely sure why. Again, it's the same data error that we discovered in 2010, where it's around the Redstone campus area. For some reason, there's a large number of people that are allocated to a block where there's only one building with one residential building with 33 beds in it, where there's another block that, you know, shows essentially no population. So we at least have been able to isolate where we see this data issue and can work with the institutions to verify their occupied bed data to help us correct this issue.
Nice.
But we're not entirely sure why the misallocation happened.
Alex?
Megan, maybe this, what David said, it'll be coming later, but do you have any thoughts about the population growth versus the increase in the number of housing units? Like have, you know, something like 2,500 more people, but only about 1,300 more housing units. I don't know. I thought that's what's really interesting. There's a lot of things that are interesting. And thank you for presenting that.
That is something that we are looking forward to additional releases to help us understand more in terms of household size and how that has changed across the city in the last 10 years. That was, you know, even in looking at kind of ward by ward, what we saw as population changes, that was one question that we had, is wanting to really understand it's one thing to see the population change, but we also want to understand how that relates to the housing unit change and the household size as well. But we'll have to look for more census data to help us understand that better.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Anything else?
Well, can I just ask the obvious
Yeah.
follow-up? I not being good at math in my head. What are you observing in terms of household size per ward, I suppose?
Per ward, I think we'd be looking at around, like, as a city as a whole, population relative to our households is a little, maybe around 2.5, a little under 2.5 as a household size. But again, I would like to see the data. One of the things about the data is you might have noticed that there are also some vacant housing units that are reported. So that also factors into the household size. I'm not sure, how big households are when you factor that in.
But, and we also have kind of two competing forces around household size. I mean, if you think across the country, the demographics are typically saying the household size is getting smaller. Americans are having less children, that type of thing. But as a college town, we have more kind of multifamily units, groups of people living together, which is going to push that number in the other direction, as well as being a refugee community where they also live, different refugee groups live in groups, extended family groups, which also push the unit population size in the other direction as well. So I think particularly once we're able to kind of tease in a more of a block group by block group basis, understanding the housing types and perhaps the ethnicities, we may see more evidence of those two forces.
Anything else from anyone? Well, great. Thanks.
I do see Sharon Busher's hand again.
Sure.
Andy, if you're okay.
Yep, go ahead.
Sharon, I think you should be able to speak.
Thank you. So as I worked for the Census Bureau as an enumerator for 2020, and it was the first time that they went electronic. We had an iPhone, which had a script and all of the questions. It was really very slick. But I wanted to just say two things. One is because it was the first time they had gone from paper to an electronic method, I can imagine and actually experienced some of the addresses that were wrong in 2010 were carried over into the electronic base, and it was very difficult to change. You can't change an address. You can notify, and we're part of the New York region. So I think that I don't know how soon that would be remedied. I'm not surprised that it continued, but this was the first time I was ever an enumerator, so I don't have a lengthy history. That's number one. Number two, the last point I wanted to make is because of COVID, the census was delayed, and then our president at the time had a strong desire to end this process, to not count all people of color and everyone. He was motivated to end the census before the work was done, and that happened. So the information we have was the best that people could gather, but the process was not complete in many areas. And I just wanted to let you all know that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Anyone else before we close out this item? All right. Well, Megan, again, thank you for presenting this to us.
Welcome.
Next item is our new item 8, which is commissioner items. Our next meeting is Tuesday, September 28th. Are there any other commissioner items from anyone? All right, then we have minutes and communications. We do have some minutes and some communications in our packet. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications? Motion,
I'd
Alex.
like to move that we accept the minutes and the communications, but I had a question about them. Thank you for reminding me.
Sure.
Can I ask a question of David
Yes.
and or Megan?
You can ask it of David because he took the minutes at your last meeting.
It's about the communication actually from
Oh.
UVM to redo the street that runs in front of the UVM green, whether it's University Place Terrace or Boulevard, I forget which. Do you have any
You
thoughts
are-
about that, David? Like,
University
happen there?
Place.
Yeah.
thank you.
So this is something that I've worked for the city for 26 years. And one of the first meetings I went to when I started in 1995 was a conversation with UVM about University Place. So it's been going on for a long time. And I think finally there's been in the last couple of years, some movement around how do we ensure that that street kind of lives up to its potential as a front door to the university, at the entrance to the city. But it's always been about kind of ultimately who's responsible for what costs of what improvements and how they happen. I don't know a whole lot more about the project than that kind of lengthy history, but is
So,
there a
and-
specific question?
Just for, just so that, especially for the new commissioners too, when you see these really lengthy packets of communications that say things about Act 250, the reason you receive these is because the Planning Commission is indicated as a party that receives all of the communications about Act 250 permits that happen which is a state level permitting process for development that happen within Burlington. And so these communications come to you and you're afforded the opportunity to comment on them in the formal process if you ever would like to take them up. So you'll often see a lot of these in here. They're kind of just informative for you. I think maybe once or twice we've ever actually talked about these since I've been here. So Alex, the one that's in here is actually not from UVM, it's actually from the city of Burlington. So this was actually submitting a form to find out whether or not an Act 250 permit would be required for the city to do the work. But in there, you can see just a brief description of what the proposed improvements are to University Place, which includes actually converting the street to one-way traffic flow. I think it's going north. So it would go from Main Street up to Colchester Avenue. And then making other improvements to help with bike and pedestrian safety and accessibility. I think that in one of the, like David said, this is something that the city's been working on for a very long time. In one of the more recent presentations that I've seen about this, the kind of feel and look of the street was a little bit like Church Street. It was a very, approachable kind of pedestrian first design that also enabled the street to feel a little bit more like a plaza and be useful for other purposes as well. But if you'd like, we can see if we can pull up a presentation or a drawing or something like that from DPW and forward it on to you for reference.
I always like pictures, Megan. Thank you. I get the idea from the project description.
Yeah.
My understanding, and I could be completely wrong about this, was that the university would prefer to close it to everything but, emergency vehicles and buses, and that the city would prefer to keep it open for traffic flow, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know the resolution of that, but I would assume based on this, that with the maintenance of one-way traffic flow, that there has been some resolution about that. Yeah, we could ask DPW if there's something that we could pass along to you that just helps you understand where the project is currently. I know also from the city council meeting last night, there was a request to secure some funding to make some of the stormwater improvements associated with this project. So I think that's a good sign in terms of its, progress to becoming real.
As a front door of the university, it's a street with really crappy pavement that has a lot of traffic on it.
Yes, it is.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understood again. So it's just that it's asking for determination on whether Act 250 is required for the improvements. So
That's right.
presumably we'd see it again if in fact it was 250 was required, right?
It's not.
What's
Not
that?
necessarily, that you
Okay.
would,
Not
might
required.
see more correspondence with regard to it. So it's the city asking for an official opinion. Does jurisdiction apply for Act 250? If it does, then it'll be reviewed by the District Environmental Commission. And as I said, there'll be correspondence on it. If there's specific interest that the commission has in this project, we can be sure to get an overview so that if there are comments or questions you have, you could forward that
Yeah,
on.
and that was, I mean, presumably our reason we're copied is conformance with other plans. So just on the bike aspect, you know, that particular segment would be pretty great for biking, but then obviously like once you hit Maine, you're kind of stuck. So I suppose just kind of seeing how it plays in, you know, to the network generally, if in fact, you know, we need to comment on conformance with other plans would be an aspect of that it would be interesting, and I think valuable for us to look at.
The opinion in page 21 of our packet says from the Natural Resources Board says an Act 250 permit is not required.
That's correct.
So
Apologies thank you for the close reading, and apologies for missing that.
No problem. It's a communication. I move that we accept the minutes in communication.
yes, so I was just going to bring us back to that. Thank you, Alex. We have the motion to approve the minutes and
second
accept
that.
communications. We have a second from Emily. Any more discussion on them? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand or say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That passes. And then
And
we're on.
if I could just,
Yes,
based on that previous conversation, on DPW's website, they actually have some material devoted to this project where you can see more about what's being proposed in the various phases.
great.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And just because it sounds like you're interested, Michael, one other place, just for the background on how that project would integrate with Main Street, you could look at the Plan BTV walk bike. There are some recommendations for major east-west bike connections, and one of the connections coming into downtown does contemplate a bike lane coming into downtown on Main Street. So, all right, sorry, Andy, thank you.
No problem. So we're on to our last item, which is now item 10, which is adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by
to
Alex, seconded by Emily. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion to adjourn, say aye.
Hi.
We stand adjourned. Thank you all very much. And
Have a
see
great
you
evening,
all
everyone.
at our next meeting on September 28th.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Andy.